everyone please welcome the next storyteller, Sam.
On the first day of class, he said, I always wear green on Fridays. And so he did. Green pullovers, green tweed jackets, mostly green sweater vests. And that's why I came to know him, Mr. Canary, my 11th grade English teacher. He had a manic energy about him that I had never seen before. Well, not at least since 8th grade, when Mrs. Heisey would torture us on one day, having us diagram sentences, and then on the next day play Blue Oyster Cult during creative writing. And while Mrs. Heisey tried to be cool, Mr. Canary owned and embraced his idiosyncrasies. He was John Keating before Dead Poet Society was ever conceived of. He had us read Macbeth aloud in class, and he would assign all of the parts at the beginning of the class. Well, not all of the parts, because he would always insist on playing Lady Macbeth. And he would roar with glee at the gory parts, and he would stand on his desk to deliver the soliloquies, and I was mesmerized. We were all mesmerized. He breathed life and vitality into the standard 11th grade texts. He forced us to look beyond the words. He taught us things that we didn't even conceive of. My senior year English teacher was the exact and total opposite of Mr. Canary, soporific, sonorous. He would dehydrate and pulverize literature and spoon feed us the ashes, and we'd choke on them for the lack of any juice or flavor. And between the late night drinking and early morning pot smoking, my senior year was a wash, and my grades reflected that. At the same time, through this haze, I was applying to college, and my father, who was caught up in his own divorce, only seemed to remember me as the precocious 4th grader. And so he insisted that I apply to the Ivy and sub-Ivies he had failed to pay attention to, or had blindly neglected my eroding grades and the late nights coming in and the ever-shrinking amount of Manischewitz in the bottle on the bottom of the refrigerator. But he insisted, and so I complied. And along the way, during that winter of my senior year, I happened upon Mr. Canary and asked for his advice. And he asked where I was applying to school, and I told him. I said, I'm applying to Harvard and Princeton and Swarthmore and on, 20 schools. And he looked at me and he paused and he said, you should apply to the University of Chicago. What? The University of what? He said, the University of Chicago. I said, why? I didn't know anything about Chicago. I'd never heard of the University of Chicago. The only thing I knew about Chicago was that it was 1,000 miles away, and I only knew what it looked like from the opening sequence of Good Times. He said, patiently, the University of Chicago is the teacher of teachers. I don't want to be a teacher. Well, what do you want to be? I don't know. I don't want to be a teacher. My dad thinks I'm going to be a doctor, but I don't think that's going to work out. He said, do this for me. Just apply to the University of Chicago. And I paused because this was real advice. This wasn't just some random suggestion. This was a man who knew my grades, and he knew where I was applying. But most importantly, he was somebody who knew me as a person. And this adult, this teacher, clearly wanted to see me succeed. And so I applied. And during February and March of that year, I would rush home to the mailbox to see what school was going to lift me out of New Jersey. But that winter was a flurry of thin envelopes. Harvard, no. Brown, no. Yale, no. On and on. Until one day, I got a thick envelope. The thick envelope. The University of Chicago. And by that point, I had decided that I wasn't going to study science, I was going to study philosophy. And when I told my father, a doctor, of my plan, he said, I am not paying to send you to some liberal urban commune so you can study that crap. And it dawned on me right there that this was meant to be. And I said to my father quietly, "But Dad, it's the teacher of teachers." 6 months later, I left New Jersey and I never went back. It turns out that along the way, I did become a teacher. The University of Chicago turns out to be one of the most rigorous institutions in the United States. And there I found my mind and my voice and my way of thinking. And I learned to teach, first as a teaching assistant and then teaching community college during graduate school. And then ultimately I went on to medical school and I became a doctor. And to become a doctor is really just to become a teacher, because the word doctor comes from the Latin docere, to teach. And what I pride myself on most is not the mastery of any particular science or medicine or any type of fact base, but my ability to explain complex topics to people in language that they understand. And to instill in them the same enthusiasm for science and medicine that I had for Macbeth so many years ago. About 10 years ago, at a transition point during my career, I tracked down Mr. Canary. It took me a long time, but I found him. I got in touch with him by telephone on a Friday afternoon. "Is this Mr. Canary, John Canary?" "Yes." "Mr. Canary, I want to thank you because 20 years ago, you changed my life. And in doing so, you set me on a path that allowed me to change the life of thousands of people." "Really? You're kidding. How did I do that?" I said, "You are the teacher of teachers. Thank you."